All right. Well, thank you all for joining. I'm Joey Asher, president of Speechworks. My colleague is JD Clockadale, and I'd like to get started by introducing our special guest. This program today is focusing on the idea of how do we communicate effectively with investors. I was particularly interested in this topic because investors are a tough audience. They're smart. They're very intelligent. They're tough. And as Isabel points out, they can be a little bit snarky. And nobody knows better as to how to deal with this type of an audience than our guest today, Isabel Janci. Isabel is the Vice President of Investor Relations for the Home Depot. She's also the treasurer. But she has had sort of an interesting tour of duty. I actually first met Isabel I'm not sure how many years ago, when she was with the Home Depot and then left to go to several other companies where she served in an investor relations capacity. She's been with Intercontinental Exchange. She's been with Novelis. More recently, she's been with Global Payments. She's a true expert in terms of the investor relations, and we're really fortunate to have Isabel here. Thank you, Isabel, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Joey. I'm happy to be here.
And I know it's a particularly challenging time. Before we sort of dive into all of this, some of our audience may not know a lot about sort of the investor relations role and sort of what that is. Could you just start by just giving us a quick overview of just what is the role of an investor relations person at a place like the Home Depot?
Sure. So, I would describe investor relations really as a blended role between finance and communications. And we're really the gatekeeper to management, to maximizing their time in terms of who they spend that time with. We also serve as a strategic advisor to management and to the board of directors. And, the role more recently has evolved to now include ESG communications, which of course has, added a new set of responsibilities.
What do you mean by ESG?
ESG is environmental, social, and governance matters. And, as you can appreciate, over the last year, these have really been in the spotlight, particularly social issues with, what we saw with civil unrest and racial injustice. And so there's a whole focus area from investors to say, this poses a risk to corporations. So what are you doing about your human capital management? What are you doing to take care of your people? What are the metrics that we should be tuning into to ensure that you are doing the right thing for your people and that doesn't pose a risk to your company?
All right. Well, very good. Well, yeah, it sounds like it's a role that sort of has an interesting foot both in the finance side and also the communication side. And so it's a very interesting sort of combination role. It sort of takes a unique skill set. One of the reasons, of course, we were talking before, it's challenging is because the typical audience is the Wall Street analyst and investor community. Tell us about this audience. And, we mentioned that we sort of jokingly said they can be kind of snarky, which I don't know, maybe it's not jokingly, but they really can be a challenge. What makes them such a difficult audience?
Yeah, I think the main reason that they're tough is because they want you to quantify everything, right? They are trying to build a model. They need inputs to that model in terms of very specific numbers. And, and they're going to make bets. They're going to make bets on, are you going to be a winner in this environment? Are you going to be a loser in this environment? Are they buying the stock? Are they selling the stock? Are they recommending that folks buy the stock? And, they want you to produce results in a linear fashion. And, today more than ever, I think we can all appreciate that things do not behave in a linear fashion. We don't operate in a vacuum. Who would have thought, a year ago that we would be in a pandemic that has essentially changed everything from, where we work, how we communicate with one another. So things aren't always linear, which also, poses challenges from that standpoint as well.
So let's talk about when we get to give presentations to them. How do we prepare for presentations to this difficult audience? Because I think a lot of people, as they're listening in, we all have to deal with some difficult audiences. How do you address that difficult audience?
Yeah, I think, preparation is definitely critical, and determining what it is that you're trying to convey is just as critical. Keeping it simplicity is important. And I know, you ascribe to, what are the three things you're trying to convey? We try to stick to that. Sometimes it ends up being five things we convey, but what are the main things you're trying to convey? What are the supporting points to convey those messages? And then what are, you have to continue to emphasize the main messages that you want them to take away. And, when you provide too much information without organizing it in a digestible manner, people just don't know what to think. They don't know what to walk away with. And it just makes it more difficult, and you're just really making it harder on yourself. So simplicity of message is critical.
And so tell me what you do. You actually spend time with the senior level folks at the Home Depot, helping them actually prepare for the message. Do you tell them what the message should be, or do they tell you what the message should be, or is there some sort of joint discussion? How do you go about that?
Well, the team and I prepare executives before every single event. We take prep very seriously. The management team, luckily, does as well. They see the value in being aligned. So the team and I try to do a lot of the heavy lifting up front. So we put, a document together that has our key messages every quarter, for instance. And, because we speak to the street on a daily basis, we have a pulse on what are the issues, what are the questions, what are the concerns, what are the misperceptions. So we put that together with a list of the most salient questions. We affectionately call that hot topics. And, we will populate that with answers. But then we get together with the management team and we spend as much time as necessary going through each and every section. So, of course, the first section is key messages. And, what are we going to anchor around? What are we going to try to convey in every conversation that we have? And we have to make sure we get those right. And, this is something that not only the investor relations team is going to talk to the street about, but every member of management, every member of the senior leadership team. And we showcase a lot of breadth of our management team. So we need, alignment for us is pretty critical. But we go question by question and we go through every single answer to make sure we are all on board. And, sometimes the IR team is very good, but sometimes we don't get the answer quite right, or there's more to it than we knew. So we end up having really good discussions and end up at a very good place in terms of, having adequate answers for questions we know that we're going to get about the quarter, about the business, about the strategy.
By the way, I have more questions, but I want everyone who's on the call to feel free to go to the chat box and ask questions of Isabel. This is a very interesting and rich subject. So feel free at any time to jump in and ask questions. We really are very interested in your questions. I want to follow up with something you just said. One of the things that sort of it has occurred to me, and as you know, we have done some work with you guys. Home Depot is an incredibly big, complicated business. And, you could go and you could talk about what the Home Depot is doing. You could spend, days talking about it. How do you decide what is the most important thing to focus on? Because you obviously can't talk about everything with these guys.
Yeah, no, we spend a lot of time trying to determine or trying to distill our key messages down to the most important messages. And, you can really see this when we have investor conferences. And our last investor conferences we had, we opened it up with, here are the 5 things you should take away from today's event. And then we supported, some of those key messages with some examples and some stories to really kind of help folks, help the concepts resonate with folks. And then we ended it with the same messages at the end. So we could kind of emphasize, this is what you should take away. And, again, we try to distill it to the most simplest form when we can't, well, let's talk about the simplicity of it. So, our strategy at the most simple form, our strategy is grow the top line and grow sales in any economic environment. That's why we invest in the business. That's why, that's really what we're focused on doing. we can deconstruct that and we can go a lot of places after that. But at the end of the day, that is the simple message of what we are trying to achieve. But everything, unfortunately, can't be as simple as that, right? There's more complex discussions that we have to have at times. For us, our supply chain operations and investments can be very complex. And, this is something that you taught me many years ago. Sometimes stories are the best way, examples are the best way to help people understand and demystify complexity. And so, we'll use that as supporting points when we're trying to convey messages. But we do try to wrap it up kind of nicely in a bow for everybody and distill messages in the simplest way possible.
Let's talk a little bit about data, because you mentioned that you have to that they want everything distilled to a number. How do you deal with that issue? How do you talk effectively about data? I know there's some specific pieces of data that they specifically always want. How do you go about preparing everybody to speak effectively about data? Because some people are good at that and some people are not so good at that.
Well, we have a lot of conversations about what data is important to the street, and we have a lot of conversations about how we're going to talk about that. I mean, what's been particularly difficult during this period of time is that we suspended guidance in the first quarter, and so we're approaching the 1 year mark of no guidance because we have not reinstated guidance. And what makes it?
Let me interrupt real quick. And so just explain for those who don't know what you mean by guidance.
Right. So annually we provide, on our fourth quarter call. So our fourth quarter, call was last month. We typically say for the coming year, this is what we project will happen with sales. This is what we project will happen with margins. This is what we project will happen with earnings growth. And then we give them some other kind of financial inputs to the model. Because of the uncertainty of the environment, we suspended the guidance that we had last year, and we have not reinstated it because there's just too many unknown variables to be able to do that in a way that is effective. But that poses problems, right? Because, we started this conversation with this audience is tough. And the reason that they're tough is they want you to quantify everything and give them numbers they can put in their model. Now, if you have no guidance, you have nothing to anchor around in terms of numbers. So it really forces you to have a conversation where you're providing, color around those numbers, and you're better informing the street on how to think about certain inputs into their models. And, that essentially helps them come to a better conclusion on the inputs they need to decide on.
So it's interesting. It sounds like you are, I'm not going to try and pin you down on this, but it sounds like you're suggesting that this is kind of refreshing not to have the guidance out there.
I don't know that I would say it's refreshing. It makes the job a lot more difficult. That's for sure.
I think it makes it more difficult.
Yes. Yeah. Because, when you have guidance, you can anchor around assumptions to that guidance. And, you can give them kind of more, if you have a sales number and you say sales are going to grow, I'm just making this up, sales are going to go 5%. Well, tell us what that means for the beginning of the year. What's the first half of the year look like? What's the second half of the year look like? Where is that growth coming from? What are the fundamental, drivers of that growth? So it helps you anchor that discussion versus what are, sales going to grow this year? Well, we don't have guidance. So, we cannot provide that information at this point because of all the uncertainties. Well, then that opens up a lot of questions in terms of, okay, well, you used to give me the building blocks and tell me what the drivers of that growth are. Now I have no building blocks. GDP was something that was a foundational building block to our business. GDP and our sales have completely disconnected. So it just makes that conversation more difficult, right? Because now we're having a conversation that is truly based on providing more color and insight on the dialogue we're having internally versus hard and fast numbers.
So in this, I want to, by the way, I have more questions, but I want to take a pause here and just see if anybody has any questions for Isabel or any questions for anyone, any questions in general. I just want to, I know we get to talking here, and I don't want to sort of bogart all the time here. Just will take a moment. Does anybody have any questions for Isabel? I know it's an very interesting topic. Well, feel free to feel free. There's a Home Depot person who just popped up there, by the way. Sean, good to see you.
Hey, good to see you, Joey. I kind of have a follow-up to it. On the street, you can say you're not going to provide guidance, but if it's a VP or someone like that, you can't really give them that answer. What tactics could we use to maybe not provide certainty, but give them some clarity?
Sean, are you asking for your own personal benefit? When somebody asks for something specific and you can't give that answer, what do you do? Is that what you mean?
Correct, right? Because as an investor, the street's going to ask you questions about guidance. But in an organization, you may not have that opportunity to say, I can't give you guidance on that. But looking for some tactics on how to manage something like that.
Isabel, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah. So Sean, well, first of all, I really like your shirt. Second of all, just to clarify the question to make sure I'm answering the question you're asking. So are you asking if somebody internally asks about how we're thinking about the performance of the company, then what the answer is?
Not necessarily the performance of the company, but it's a scenario where you're asked to answer something there where there is uncertainty, right? Like how the market's going to do.
Sure. Okay.
And around that, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, I think the conversation really revolves around let's talk it out. Let's talk about, what is supportive of the business right now, and let's talk about the uncertainty. So what is supportive of the business? Consumers' balance sheets have never been stronger, aided by, very, very quick government response and numerous stimuluses at this point. So consumer balance sheets are quite healthy. There's been a pretty substantial wallet share shift away from travel and entertainment to home improvement because we are all working at home, we are schooling at home, we are eating at home, we are doing everything at home. So, there's a fair amount of spend that goes along with that, right? There's wear and tear. I have 3 kids running around here. That's significant wear and tear. There's, I'm staring at my ceiling fan and I want an upgrade. And so, there's those kind of spend items. And then there's, to improve my quality of living, my balance sheet is pretty strong. What am I going to do to improve my quality of living? And, we joked last year, a few quarters, that everybody in the United States was building a deck. That's what it felt like, just based on the purchases they were making with the Home Depot. And, we talk to our customers all the time. We talk to our pro customers. We talk to our consumers. They tell us the home has never been more important. They tell us they have continued intentions to spend on home improvement projects. So we feel pretty good about all of that. The issue really comes in the second half of the year. Right. In the second half of the year, presumably, hopefully, vaccines will be broadly available to everyone. And when that happens, will we have herd immunity? Will people completely change the way that they are acting? Will the home be as important as it is today? Will the spend dry up, or, is it a flip of the switch, or is it gradual? I mean, there's a lot of varying opinions here. All from, when are vaccines fully available and when do we have herd immunity? When do people start going back to normal? And then there's a lot of opinions on, do people just take to the skies and start traveling and no longer spend on their home? Some people say, yeah, that's what's going to happen. Other people say, you know what, people have built so much savings at this point that goods don't have to come at the expense of services. If services rise, it doesn't mean that people are no longer going to spend in their homes. Then there's the structural change of a lot of corporations have come out and said, you know what, everybody's going to be virtual. A lot of tech companies have said that, a lot of companies are kind of on the fence, but, you do hear that we're not going to go back to an environment that we had before. So again, the emphasis and focus goes to the home. but there's just so many unknowns that, it's hard to say, where we're going. But there's a lot of positives in the short term. Housing is another positive as well. I mean, we've seen a lot of turnover. Turnover has increased pretty dramatically with people buying homes. That has, continued to press inventory, but has caused home prices to appreciate. And while none of us, or many of us probably don't know how much our house has appreciated, we know that it has increased in value. And when it increases in value, you feel good about making investments in your home. And so, there's a multitude of positives, but, we just don't know how it's going to play out at the end of the day.
Hey, Isabel, we've gotten a couple of more questions that are coming in here. So let me ask Steve. You got a really nice question here. Why don't you unmute and just ask Isabel your question?
Sure. Thank you. So I've listened to CEOs, CFOs give their quarterly updates, and they do it in such a nice conversational style. They have to be on point with a lot of details and sometimes some tough questions. But what aids are they using? Because I don't always see them. I can hear them, but is there a coach in front of them, someone holding up signs, teleprompters? What tools do you see them using?
Typically, and this has been at multiple companies where it had been, in the room when we're having an earnings call is, the folks that are speaking, typically the CEO, the CFO, and in our case, the head of merchandising. But we have, in normal times, we have our entire executive leadership team in the room. I sit right next to our CFO. And sometimes he'll ask me questions on a piece of paper. But, we do extensive prep ahead of time. And I think because of all the prep and discussion, they feel adequately prepared. So, do they have notes next to them? Sure. But I think once they're responding, the discussion has happened a multitude of times already that they feel very comfortable with providing the answer. So, I think it's what we've been talking about. It's, what's going to get asked. So the better you prepare, the more confident you are in providing the answer. And after discussing the answer several times, you don't really need to have a teleprompter. You don't really need to have anything other than some notes to make you feel better in case, something comes up that you're not prepared to answer.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting subject. I hope I'm pronouncing this person's name correctly. Guy Nebel. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Do you want to unmute and ask your questions? Interesting question also.
Oh, no. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, apologies. I thought my camera was on. So the question is, it's always about results. And if you're getting asked a question on results, a detail that you don't drill down to, something you don't really want to answer, like what's the strategy to reply? Is it simply we don't comment on it? Or is there like a softer approach where we don't comment on it, but let me talk about this? Or like, what's the strategy there to address the investor?
Yeah, Guy, that's a good question. And I hate that we don't comment on it. It just seems very closed off. So sometimes you can't avoid it, if somebody keeps pushing the issue and that's when a snarky investor will do that, then, you just have to say, I can't give you the specifics because, either that's competitively sensitive or we don't disclose it or, whatever the reason is. But from my perspective, what I always try to do is provide some color around it. As much color as I can provide so they feel like they have some information about the topic, even if I can't give them the specific number.
I want to give one more. We're running out of time, but Marko, do you want to unmute? You got a really interesting question here also. Can you hear me, Marko?
Yes, I can. Sure. So my question really is, do you have a difference of approach between different investor types? I think they all have, between a private equity investor, institutional investor, and let's say if you're going into a VC and trying to pitch a new project, what would you say is the big difference in approaches between those different investors?
Not really. We try to really convey our message about our business and really, tell our story. So I would say the difference is kind of on their end, right? So if it's a hedge fund, who may be, and I'm picking on hedge funds, but who may have a shorter term horizon, their question might be very specific to the quarter and, what's going to happen in the next quarter. The approach that I would take there is, I'm not trying to be unhelpful, and if I can answer that question, I will answer that question, but I will then make it, a broader question. We think about it this way, but what we're trying to achieve is, XYZ on a broader basis. So always trying to convey what I want to convey, and usually there's not a real different approach there. It's how how that investor is asking us the question, whether it's short-term in nature, whether they're trying to get information about a competitor. I've had that, there's an activist investor in our biggest competitor that looks just like us. And, they call all the time trying to get information on how we're doing things that I know is going to potentially be fed back to our competitor. So I'm very guarded. I will provide the information that is out there, but I also look at it through the lens of who is asking the question and why are they asking the question.
We're almost out of time, but I want to follow up just a little bit because it seems a little bit relevant to what we're talking about here. Is we talked about the snarkiness issue, and Melissa made the point that you shouldn't be snarky back. How do you deal with when people are snarky? I really try not to be snarky back. Every once in a while I can't help myself, but usually when I get a Lowe's question that gets under my skin sometimes, but I think the answer we were talking about before is right. I mean, there's no reason to get defensive at all. I think, if you get defensive, you have kind of lost in that discussion. I think it's really around trying to explain your position. And, they usually get snarky when it's, an answer they don't want to hear, and or something that has disappointed them, because an investor, can pitch, okay, let's buy the Home Depot because we think the Home Depot is going to do X, Y, and Z. And if it doesn't materialize the way they told their boss, then they don't look good. And so, they want explanations. And so I think it's just kind of working with that person to try to give them, some explanation or some message that they can then take back. So, trying to stay focused on the conversation and staying calm and not getting defensive, I think is really important. All right. Well, very good. Well, this has been really helpful to me. One of the things that I've taken away from this is, number one, just a lot of preparation. When you're dealing with these tough audiences, a lot of preparation, spending a lot of time on preparing for the Q&A and doing your best not to get snarky back. But I understand at times that can be challenging. It's 12:31. I want to thank Isabel for coming. This was a really interesting discussion. I want to thank everybody once again for joining our every other week webinars. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you all for coming. Have a great weekend.
Thank you all. Have a good weekend.